right. Good morning, folks. I'm just going to take another minute before we get started. Thanks for joining us this morning. All right, we got a good group here. Okay, well, might as well get started with introductions. Good morning, my name is Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with DLCD. I've kind of been heading up the work on climate-friendly areas, which is why I'm with you today. We have other staff members here to assist: Cody Meyer, Matt Kroll, Bill Holmstrom, Casaria Taylor, and let's see, did I miss anybody? Oh, Kirsten Green. Hello, Kirsten. So let's go ahead. Oh, and Evan, I see Evan is with us as well. Let's go ahead and do introductions of the non-DLCD staff. Why don't we start with Bill, then Heather, and then Barbara.
Hi, Bill Grout, Planning Commissioner for City of Aurora, North Marion School Board.
Hi, Heather O'Donnell, Senior Planner with the City of Eugene.
Good morning. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Cornelius.
All right, thanks. Next up, Matt Brinkley, Michael Sporlick, and Molly Markarian.
I'm Matt Brinkley, Planning Director, City of Medford.
Michael Sporlick, and I am an independent consultant focusing on issues related to disability.
I'm Molly Markarian, Senior Planner with the City of Springfield.
All right. Next, Jonathan Harker, Page West. Al Johnson.
Good morning, Jonathan Harker, retired Gresham City Planner representing OAPA on the RAC.
Hello, my name is Paige West. I'm the Senior Planner for Rogue Valley Transit.
Good morning, I'm Al Johnson. I'm a retired land use attorney.
All right. Damian Cernick. I'm sorry, Damian, I'm not getting your last name quite right, so you can feel free to correct me. Damian, Ted Reed, Rebecca Lewis.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Damian Cernick. I'm a Senior Planner with the City of Bend's Growth Management Division.
Good morning, I'm Ted Reed with Metro's Planning and Development Department.
Hi, Rebecca Lewis. I'm a professor in planning at the University of Oregon.
All right. Michelle Miller, Jeremy Rogers, and Eunice Kim.
Morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Miller. I'm with Washington County Community Planning. I'm a senior planner.
Hi, everyone. Jeremy Rogers, Director of Legal Affairs and Public Policy with the Oregon Realtors.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Eunice Kim, Long Range Planner with the City of Salem.
Brock Nation, Brian Martin. Oh, I see Gordon Howard with DLCD is also with us. Good morning, Gordon. Let's go with Brock, Brian, and Elisa Chang.
Check. Hi, everyone. Brock Nation, Grassroots Advocacy Manager at Oregon Realtors.
Hi, all. Brian Martin, Long Range Planning Manager with the City of Beaverton.
Hi, I'm Elisa Chang. I'm from Bend, Oregon, and I am a board member of Bend Bikes.
All right, welcome. Bob Courtwright, and let's see. I see Brian Hurley from ODOT is also with us. Good morning, Brian. And Mary Kyle McCurdy.
I'm Bob Courtwright, former staff at DLCD and working with OEC and Thousand Friends.
I'm Mary Kyle McCurdy with 1000 Friends of Oregon. I'll be switching to my computer in a bit, but I'm on the phone now.
Right.
Brian Hurley from the Oregon Department of Transportation Climate Office, and I'm here to listen and learn. Good morning, everyone.
All right, good morning. And I see Ariel Nelson has just joined us, and we also have somebody on the phone at the last 4 digits, 4239. Ariel?
Sorry, having just joined, are we doing introductions or?
Yep, introductions. Yep.
Okay, thanks. This is Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities.
And then lastly, if the person at 4239 could introduce themselves. No. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I think I got everyone, but if I missed somebody, please speak up.
Kevin, if
yeah.
I may, just for the folks on the phone, a friendly reminder, the *6 is the unmute. It can be hard by phone. Like, how do I do that?
There we go. Thanks, Kirsten. This is Mallory with the Association of Oregon Counties on the phone.
Cool.
Okay, great. Welcome, Mallory. All right, fantastic. What I'd like to do at the outset here is to kind of share a list of topic areas that I'm anticipating we're going to be talking about, but I also want to open it up for other items. So this is a list I've developed just based on, gotten a lot of feedback on climate-friendly areas. So I'll share that with you. In some areas, I have some thoughts about how we might address it. And so I'd like to kind of float those concepts, but certainly not limiting the discussion to only those approaches. Definitely want to have a free and open conversation about these issues today. We have 2 hours. I think it's going to go fast. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and share screens. And then if there's something that you see as a pressing issue that you'd like to add to the list, then let's go ahead and do that. So here is the list of topics that I've developed thus far based on the input that we've heard. Is that big enough for people to be able to read? I can make it a little larger if that would be helpful. All right, so today we're talking about climate-friendly areas. We're also talking a little bit about section 0330, the land use requirements. So those are requirements that apply beyond just climate-friendly areas, but throughout local government jurisdiction. So I want to make sure that we are cognizant we're talking not just climate-friendly areas, but also the land use requirements section. So in terms of the feedback that we've heard thus far, some of the issues identified, allowing for more residential ownership opportunities in climate-friendly areas, whether requiring minimum densities in mixed-use development is kind of counterproductive. And I say in mixed-use development, I'm saying on a specific development site, if you have a mixed-use development that includes, say, employment or office and residential, does it make sense to establish minimum densities there? Broadly, the issue of 30% of housing in climate-friendly areas and impacts on housing elsewhere in communities. And I think I'd like to do a little bit of clarification on how we intend for the rules to apply there. But I know that's a big issue for a number of us. Question of whether a climate-friendly area designation, that first step is a land use decision. And related to that, the phased implementation and timeline that we have in the draft rules. Question of parks, open space, street trees in climate-friendly areas, and frankly, possibly elsewhere in the cities or local government jurisdiction. Dimensional requirements for climate-friendly areas, provision for employment opportunities. And at this point, I'll pause if there are other things that should be on the list. Maybe if you could raise hands, or just speak up. Yeah, Jeremy?
Thanks a lot, Kevin. Yeah, I think this is a good list. One thing I would add, and it kind of touches on many of these things, or could, is sort of the need for analysis around sort of feasibility and sort of, how these rules would play out on the ground with the market realities of different communities and impact housing production, housing costs, the type of housing in terms of rental versus ownership. So I think there's some analysis that could be done that could maybe help us get at some of these other issues that are on this list. Thank you.
Damian.
Thanks, Kevin. I think just a clarifying question regarding provisions for employment opportunities. Does this include employment, but also opportunities for neighborhood services, groceries, clothes, medical clinics, vets, all the above? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Really, we focused on residential, but the reality is that we want a variety of mixes of uses here. And for these areas to be successful, they need to contain that. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Ariel?
Thanks, Kevin. I don't know if this is a discussion item for today, but I was wondering if it would be possible to get a list of which cities will be required to designate climate friendly areas and which populations apply to which cities. And then also similarly, if any unincorporated counties, how that applies. I don't know that we've really seen a clarified list of like who is exactly needing to be meeting these rules.
Actually, Ariel, we do have
You
that
have that?
information. Yeah,
Okay.
it's in. Yeah, I believe it's in our RAC 9 packet. And
Okay.
maybe another
Haven't
team
made it all the
member
way
might be
through.
able to put a
Okay.
link to that in the chat. But yeah,
Thank you.
you bet. Sandy, and welcome, Sandy.
Good morning. Sorry, I was having trouble getting online, but heard the introductions via YouTube. I think another topic to add here is how the climate-friendly areas affects the land use assumptions that go into the transportation model.
Okay. Heather?
Good morning. I'm not sure if it would be covered in any of these, but one of the things that we wanted to explore was whether or not it feels like the requirements around the development standards around a climate friendly area, the height, particularly, and then the densities together are kind of a one size fits all for each city size. And so wanting to explore the possibility of variations to that.
Okay. I will note, we do have an outcome-based path
Yes.
that would allow more flexibility there, but yeah.
Okay.
On the list. Al?
See, I'm off mute. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think you probably know some of my concerns. I'm concerned about how CFAs affect land use assumptions that are used for developing housing needs analyses and for expanding urban growth boundaries, and whether they actually effectually preempt the requirements that would normally be applied under Goal 10 and the Housing Needs Statute. And that relates back to the first item, allowing for more residential ownership opportunities in CFAs. I would change that to say allowing for more residential ownership opportunities in urban growth areas, because I'm assuming that CFAs, because they're going to be so dense and are really going to preclude single family dwellings of all kinds, attached and detached, that are not, in big condo buildings, that there is going to be no opportunity for home ownership of the traditional kind, except in other parts of urban areas. So this gets to the issue of how this affects access to to opportunities for home ownership in urban areas. And of course, the reason I'm concerned about that is what we know is that our past history of residential segregation has resulted in tremendous differences in home ownership between whites and blacks and other protected classes. So it really is just that the modification you just made is what I'm looking for.
Okay.
Kevin, oh, sorry.
Oh.
Sorry, it's Mary Kyle. I'm on the phone, so I don't know how to raise my hand.
Oh, okay.
But I can go after Michael.
Okay.
Just give me the cue. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Mary Kyle and Kevin. One thing that I think is missing here is, and Al touched on it a little bit, is how do we protect against displacement of underserved populations? And that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is how do we actually promote better inclusion of, what measures can we take to promote a more diverse and robust community for all? So I think there are two issues there. It's one is sort of a protection, non-discrimination issue, and the other is how do we promote better diversity, better opportunities for people who are underserved.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Let's go to Mary Kyle and then back to Damian.
Thanks. In terms of analysis or information that might be needed, I think it'd be useful to know the percentage of housing that's in compact walkable areas now. And all these communities have things that are functionally CFAs. The boundaries might not be exactly right. There might be some other tweaking, but the existing transportation planning rule has required designation of these compact mixed use areas for a couple decades. So I'm wondering what the percentage of housing is inside these for, Corvallis, for Albany, for whatever communities, because I hear a lot of fear, and I'm wondering if it's just as big a leap and as new a thing as people are maybe concerned about. So if there's some information like that, even some sampling, I think that would be useful.
Sure. Yeah. It's maybe not necessarily a rule amendment issue, but an informational issue. Okay, I won't respond to that right now, but I've got it on the list here. Damian?
Thanks. I'm sorry I didn't think about this before, but I'm glad Michael brought it up. I think one of the things I wanted to flag for discussion when we get there is regarding displacement. The current rules talk about actions that local governments need to take. And I wanted to get some discussion about what those look like, some examples, or if that's something that might be handled more outside the rule through some kind of technical guidance.
Sure. Right. Very good. Very good. All right, Matt, I think you're up next.
Yeah, I'd like to get some clarification on the performance or outcomes-based density path.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sarah? Yeah, sorry, you're still muted.
Alt A will take care of that.
Alt A. Yeah, looks like some technical difficulties.
Sometimes spacebar works.
I'm sorry, spacebar?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Try holding down your spacebar. No, still not working. Shoot. All right. Well, oh, there, I think you're off mute.
Okay. Yeah, I was having technical difficulties. Zoom was spinning and I wasn't able to do anything. I apologize for that. I just wanted to, I still can't see the screen anymore, so it's tricky, but shoot. I wanted to, with respect to the 30% and impacts on other housing, yeah. I think it would be helpful to specify implementation impacts on, and negative impacts on implementation of House Bill 2001's objective of equitably distributing, affordable and just more access to housing. And just echo the concern about the potential for delaying or having that inadvertent outcome of furthering the segregation patterns, but tying it specifically to the House Bill 2001.
All right.
And I have a thought there, but I can add it later, which is, well, I'll just add it later, but it has to do with looking maybe in shifting maybe a focus to provision of services and really examining that question of density in the CFAs.
All right, I can tell already we've got a lot to talk about today. Kirsten, you've been really patient.
No, thank you. This is for you to hear from everybody else, but I just would say that with respect to, really, really appreciate the folks concerned about gentrification displacement as we're trying to lower greenhouse gases. So for those that have been in it for the long haul, many of you today are on the rack, and thank you for your service or alternates and didn't self-identify as such, but thank you. So many will remember that we've known this is a risk from the get-go. And so we're really looking to collaborate broadly, widely, and deeply on this so we can both reduce greenhouse gas pollution as well as increase equitable outcomes, which includes access to affordable housing and, that diversity across our communities that people are describing. One of the methods, you guys are the experts around this table today, and that zoning only does so much to the provision of affordable housing. So, that's why our director, Jim Rue, is fond of saying this is the state's land use program, not DLCD's land use program, right? State and all the agencies and communities, of course, it's a complete partnership. Or even definitely more so in the implementing cities and counties. So really be thinking about how other state agency programs too. Some may have caught the panel on which other agency Director Rue invited and Chair MacArthur asked other agency directors in, I think, was it just in November, to talk about aligning programs and funding strategies. So obviously, just state the obvious, is Oregon Housing Community Services leading and very strong partner in this arena. Business Oregon, please be thinking creatively about stabilization strategies. And I think when you get to this on the agenda, I apologize for going now, I have to leave at 10. But when you talk about related issues, when you talk about this, be thinking about the role of other state agencies. And Kevin, I think you'll probably bring up the range of housing solutions and strategies included in the House Bill 2003 Housing Production Strategies work, as well as the work that Dr. Bates is doing. So from the work, and many of you served on House Bill 2001 and 2003, there's an extensive appendix in rule associated with housing production strategies about creative tools to advance the provision of affordable housing. So this is just really a next deeper step with respect to CFA. So a lot more work to be done on that. It's not transactional. This will be long-standing work to implement, monitor, change, update, adapt, talk to the legislature about resources and direction. So it's a very real initiative to try and make sure that the climate-friendly areas don't become sort of elite, financially elite areas. So it'll take all of us. I appreciate everyone's concern on that. Kevin, thanks for the time. I'm going to go on hard mute here. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Kevin, I'm sorry, this is Sarah. Do you mind if I apologize for just jumping back in, but I just wanted to add one thing to the point I made before I completely shift off. And that is that my focus isn't so much on displacement with my comment, it's on entrenchment of segregatory patterns. But I think that it also goes to the issue of displacement. Personally, my prediction is that some displacement will inevitably occur, and we need to be, as much as we want to and should be planning to prevent that, if we're not also promoting the HB 2001 vision of more housing everywhere, when there's that displacement, it's a doubly negative impact. So I just think we have to be very cautious that we don't inadvertently undermine some of that production of housing in the traditionally exclusive neighborhoods too.
Throughout the cities. No, Sarah, it's a good point. I know that you guys will deepen into this. My comment was just to also address Michael's caution there. But thanks to everyone who's mentioned it. It's not been a few of you. So thank you.
Well, if I could just maybe.
Hold on, folks. We're
sorry. Okay.
getting into topic area discussion. I'm really just trying to put together a list of here's what we need to talk about today. I'd like to step through this kind of in order rather than just diving into the topic of the moment. I'm sorry, Al, but we've just got a lot of people here, and I'm trying to organize the conversation.
That's fine.
So if folks have other items that aren't on the list already, and I see a couple hands up, I'll take those two, and then let's actually start this conversation because that's really the focus today. Michael?
Oh, I think I must have not lowered my hand. So
okay.
I can pass now.
All right, thank you. Paige?
Yeah, just one thing that I'm not seeing on here is financing opportunities when we're zoning the CFAs for us to be able to turn any parking fees or income-based strategies back out into the CFA for actually building the sidewalks, helping to subsidize multi-story, multi-use development, and then also mobility wallets and making sure that we are considering ways to incentivize the residents and the employees that are living in, working in the CFAs to be able to have affordable transit, bike share, scooter share, car share, Uber subsidies, whatever. But I think the mobility wallet and the concept of having subsidized transportation choices is going to be critical to have people shift their behavior. So financing, I just haven't seen it talked about very much here.
Okay, all right. And I'll note, I mean, that may be an issue more for guidance than rule, but I think it's an important comment. Okay, Elisa, I'll take one more for the list, and then I really want to allow time for our conversation. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to add to the point right above the one about making sure that the street connectivity standards assure that CFAs are really walkable places, to add bikeable to that as well. And then I also want to talk about how making sure that CFAs aren't islands that are walkable and bikeable in and of themselves, but they don't connect with the rest of the city that they're in that aspect.
Yeah. Okay, yep. Okay. All right, we've got a very full list here. I'm going to stop share so we can actually look at one another as we're going through the discussion. So let's see. Let's go ahead and start from the top. And this may be a fairly short conversation, but in terms of there's a lot of issues that are kind of all swirling together, but creating more residential ownership opportunities in climate-friendly areas. First of all, what we have now in the rule is allowance for multifamily and multifamily only. Condominium process is one way where those units can be owned, but we know in Oregon that process is very cumbersome and hard to implement. I'm going to suggest that we add back attached single family as a use type. That would be one approach in the rules. So we would allow for that opportunity for at least one kind of ownership type. The challenge is, of course, we need to get certain, we need to reach a certain level of an intensity in these areas for the climate friendly areas to work. And so that's a little challenging. Another approach might be to simply require residential development to meet minimum density requirements and allow local governments to sort out what housing types would be able to achieve those density standards. So in other words, not be as prescriptive on what the housing types might be, but allow local governments to define that. Those are two approaches. I want to hear other input from y'all on that question. So Al, looks like you're up first.
Thanks, Kevin. I wanted to clarify that I'm on the work group that's just been set up dealing with implementation of House Bill 2003, which I believe Sarah and a couple of other people have mentioned. And I want to clarify, my real concern really is not so much with adding homeownership opportunities inside CFAs, but it's with the potential that this rule, this approach has to impair homeownership opportunities outside of CFAs and the rest of the community. That's where the home ownership opportunities will remain realistically after CFA is implemented. And my specific concern is with the language of the rule, I think it's number 6 and 315, that says that basically the CFA allocations will provide a basis for subsequent housing production strategy reports to assess progress towards fair and equitable housing. And it looks to me as if, contrary to, I think, what Kirsten's assuming, that there's a potential for this rulemaking to effectively preempt and redirect some of the work and analysis that the legislature is supposed to be doing, and that our other committee is supposed to be doing, in deciding how House Bill 2003's production strategies are supposed to work, by constraining it in a way that says future RNAs have to allocate all 30% of future housing needs to CFAs, regardless of what might be required to provide access to opportunity of various kinds in other areas. So the concern is not about collaboration. The concern is basically about being King's X here.
Okay, all right. So this is probably a good point to try to clarify this issue and how the rules are designed to operate, or at least are thinking about how they operate. So what we need to get to and this is from the statewide transportation strategy, in order to meet our GHG reduction goals, the goal is to have at least 30% of people in these areas living in climate-friendly areas. What we're trying to navigate is the space from where we are today to that desired future in 2035. That's kind of the target we're shooting for. What we've tried to do in the rules is to not be prescriptive in terms of how local governments plan for their housing needs, because as we know, under ORS 197296, essentially that is set in statute, and that process says that local governments, as they're planning for their housing needs, look at past production trends, and then they extrapolate out their land needs for residential development based on those past trends. What we're trying to establish with the climate-friendly areas is an aspirational target that says cities will be able to continue to do that. We are basically trying to, with climate-friendly area regulations, to set the table to facilitate increased housing development in climate-friendly areas. We're trying to make that opportunity possible. We're trying to move the levers we can to get more development in climate-friendly areas. The intent here is not to say we will have no more residential development elsewhere within cities. What we're trying to do is move the market and provide that in a way that doesn't price people out, looking at displacement impacts that may occur, because these areas, our goal is, if they're going to be successful, they will be high opportunity areas with good jobs, good housing, and where people are spending less of their time and money just getting around and accessing all of those opportunities. And we want to make sure those opportunities are available to everybody. They are not, in my opinion, in conflict with what we're trying to accomplish with House Bill 2001 and House Bill 2003. We, through those measures, will see more efficient use of land and more opportunities for housing ownership, just more affordable housing in general. That bill is so HB 2001 is not going to apply within climate-friendly areas because that is in a low-density residential context. So they will work in tandem to actually provide more housing opportunities both within climate-friendly areas and outside climate-friendly areas. That's our intent. you know, I'm certainly interested in if you're seeing provisions in the rule that would conflict with that, I'd like to hear it. But
well, I do. I think, Kevin, I think I basically am in line with everything you said. And I have no problem whatsoever. I completely support the idea of making this possible, facilitating it. But the fact is, I think there's a basic misunderstanding of the relationship between House Bill 197-296 and Goal 10, the housing goal. The 296 was really about the legislature reinforcing the statewide housing goal, which is about encouraging access in location, pricing, and rentals for Oregonians of all income levels. That term encouraging is basically a synonym for affirmatively furthering. That is our fair housing statute. It is citywide. It deals with access to opportunity as well as prevention of displacement. If you look at what's happening at the federal level and in California, there's an equal emphasis on assuring that people can get into neighborhoods throughout urban areas. It's not just about avoiding displacement, and it's not just about access to transit. My concern is that this language here actually does tell local jurisdictions in a at that very top level, just how much of what they have to project is going to go where. They need to make provisions so that that can happen, but they need not to be told that that's how they have to allocate it if what is necessary to comply with Goal 10, which, whereas 197-296 is very clear, that it is foundation for Goal 10 compliance. It is not a substitute for Goal 10 compliance, that you are still meeting both those requirements. Other than that, you know, if this if we don't end up with this kind of a quota system and this redirection of the production strategy, so that House Bill 2003 production strategies cannot, in certain cases, say, well, we really need to have more access to housing in a way that is going to somehow lower a city's chances of meeting the 30% requirement, that they can do that, because that's what's required for equity. That's what's required to comply with Goal 10. That's what's required to make sure that we are actually utilizing the very, very, very small part of Oregon's private lands that are available for housing of any kind.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Al. Matt?
Yeah, so looking at the two options, or the options that you've laid out for this particular one, I would allow the local jurisdictions to determine what housing types are allowed. Multifamily can mean different things. It has different meanings under building code and different meanings in local land use regulations. I would allow us to make that call. I think functionally, when you're requiring 25 units to net acre, it means that we're going to tend to have a certain housing type, and I have a problem with that, but we can talk about that later on. I would say that for this particular thing, I would allow different housing types, and we'll figure it out.
All right. Jeremy, you actually had your hand up earlier, so I'm going to call on you next.
Thanks. Sorry, I have a dog barking here. So that's and actually, Al, I was going to make some of the same points Al did, and he did it much more eloquently than I could have. So I just wanted to reinforce the points that Al made. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sandy.
Sorry, can we come back to me? I got somebody at my door.
Oh, sure. All right. Looks like Ted.
Thanks. I'm a little worried that we're second guessing the notion of compact development. It's well known that this is something that we have to do to reduce carbon emissions. Kevin, you covered this. And I think it's also worth noting that, you know, this is not without precedent in rules to prescribe a certain housing mix. In the metro region, we have the Metropolitan Housing Rule that requires cities plan for at least half of their housing in multifamily housing or attached. So this is not a new notion.
Thanks, Ted. And I have been viewing this rule similarly, that it is kind of similar to the Metro Housing Rule in the way that it would apply. Sandy, it looks like you're back.
Yeah, thank you. So the way I'm reading 0315 item number 1 is that we are required to designate climate friendly areas to accommodate 30% of our housing over the planning period, including what we already have now. So I did some calculations, and I'll try to share my screen here.
Okay.
So these are the housing units that we have now, single unit, multi-unit, and then our total. And based on our adopted housing needs analysis, this is what we need up through 2030, which is our planning horizon, so that we would have these total units in 2030. So 30% of those would be 1,500. And when you look at that 1,500 dwelling units, and then you look at how many we would have as multifamily, then I think that that's basically saying that what we have is almost all of our areas that are medium and high density would need to be in our CFAs. So I guess that's where I'm looking at how the impact is citywide. When we're going to be drawing these climate friendly areas to include all of that higher density housing. And then we'll get into the whole market reality of what that would mean. But then that's assuming that but we'll still have multifamily happening outside through the middle housing and such that will be in those lower density residential areas. But we won't have this kind of in-between zoning that we have now that's kind of the medium density, because as I'm reading the climate friendly, that's really requiring, at least for Springfield, high density residential development.
All right, so maybe, I'm sorry, I'm going to get into the weeds just a little bit here, but it's a point I should have made earlier and I didn't. One of the key differences in terms of planning for climate friendly areas is that the capacity of climate friendly areas is based on kind of a theoretical building envelope. So it essentially will look at those development regulations and say, how high can you build? What are applicable setbacks and so on? And going through that exercise, you arrive at sort of at maximum build out. Here's what we would see in these areas. And then there are some adjustment factors to account for, housing mix and, the fact that not every site is going to build to the maximum potential. It's different than the methodology that we use and will continue to be used in HNAs and HCAs, where the local government is looking at past production and basically extrapolating forward for housing needs in those areas. Over time, we hope to see more and more of that housing occurring in climate-friendly areas, but it is essentially requiring the local governments to plan and zone for more intensive development. But in terms of your accounting for your housing needs, which is done through the process that you use with an HNA, the local government would continue to look at past production in zones to determine land needs moving forward. Some of that capacity will be in climate-friendly areas. And as we see more production in climate-friendly areas, that percentage will grow.
So I don't think what you're saying is matching the language in item number 1.
Okay.
Because I'm seeing item number 1 saying that we have to account for 30% of all existing and planned.
Okay.
Not just the future development. So we have to accommodate 30% of our existing housing in those climate friendly areas, as well as what we're anticipating for the planning horizon. So that's, I think, where the rub is, at least how I'm reading this language and what I'm hearing you say the intent is.
Okay, all right, that's helpful. And I appreciate your ground truthing this, because that absolutely is helpful to us in terms of, okay, how's this looking like it's going to play out on the ground? I'm going to go to Barbara and then we'll move on to the next topic. I'm sorry, but I know we've got a lot to talk about today. This is really helpful.
I just really appreciate what Sandy just said. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you could speak up a little, you're kind of faint.
Sorry, it's because of the mask.
Sure.
So just as Sandy noted, I read the statute the same way she did, that we would have to accommodate 30% of all of our residential development throughout the city and in the climate friendly area, all residential existing and future in that area. So I think that maybe a look at the wording might be helpful. So in my comment letter, item number 13, that would wipe that one out completely if you just reviewed that one more time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kevin,
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
real quick, this is Bill. I think you need to maybe, it would be helpful to clarify about how CFAs work in the metro area. Briefly.
Oh, well, yeah. So it's completely different in the metro area. So in the Portland metro area, essentially what we're requiring local governments to do in that area is to adopt the town and regional center boundaries, and then the zoning standards that come along with that in accord with Metro's program. So local governments within the metro region would not be required to look at building heights and, prescriptive versus outcome-based standards, because there's another program that train's already well down the track, and it's just essentially kind of working consistent with that program within the Portland metro area. Thanks, Bill, for that clarification.
That is a very important clarification. Thank you. I've been waiting for a greater understanding of how the regulations would or would not apply in the Portland metro region. So thank you for the clarification.
You bet.
Kevin, can we just plug as well then that for Barbara and others in the Portland metro area, the meeting on December 15th for members of the Portland metro area to go thoroughly through the rules and with better focus on how it applies uniquely in the Portland metro area, which has already complied with their greenhouse gas reduction strategy for the Division 44 requirements through climate smart communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. It's a 2.5-hour workshop with MTAC TPAC as well as local planning directors. So, all right, let's move on to, let's see, the next topic of discussion we had. We've talked about 30%. Let's talk about, is a CFA designation a land use decision, and the phased implementation and timeline? Because I know that's a concern we've heard a lot from people, and just in terms of how this works. So the rules essentially require local governments to designate CFAs, climate friendly areas, and do some analysis of equitable housing outcomes, which our real focus here, a big focus here, is on the potential for displacement and adoption of mitigation measures that a local government can employ to avoid displacement from occurring with that work. So that's year one. Then year two, the local government actually develops those zoning regulations and comp plan amendment and adopts those on that timeline. So the question has arisen, is that initial step a land use decision? The rules as written don't really clarify that question. As we've kind of talked about this issue, the approach that I think staff are favoring at this time is essentially to make that first step a required report from the local government. So essentially it would say, here's the areas that we're looking at for climate friendly areas. Here's the analysis that we're doing of equitable housing outcomes that might occur with that designation. but it would be a report, not a land use decision. And that report, I think, would come to the department. It would also be publicly available for review and comment, but not a land use decision. The land use decision occurs at year 2 with the zone change in the comp plan amendment process. That's our thinking in terms of how that would functionally work. And I'd be interested in comments or thoughts or other ideas for that implementation. Yeah, Damian.
Well, thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. So I have a clarifying question. So I'm following you. Under what you just described, the city would do the work to identify or designate these climate-friendly, say a climate-friendly area. We would, in a report, then present our data, our findings, and what would then be the department's review process where, I guess what I'm asking is what would the department do to act on that? Would they say, thanks for sending it in, we've got it, you're good to go? Or is this more of an iterative process where there might be some further discussion and back and forth before we both mutually agree that, okay, we've got a factual base set up now for then completing the plan work and the code work to implement this climate friendly area?
Sure, that's a good question. As we're thinking about this, it is really a review and comment opportunity, both for the agency, but also the general public. And so, a process whereby we can say, take a look at the, how that work is going, provide comments that might be, you're doing a great job, or here's a course correction that you might consider, that type of dynamic, but it would not be a local government decision. Part of the thinking here is what we don't want to do is set up a series of land use decisions that are appealable that functionally will delay implementation of these rules. And so we want to make this as easy for local governments to accomplish, because we need to get these rules, active and, on the ground as soon as we can. So that's the thinking. Mary Kyle?
Thanks. I had the same question Damian did. I'm not sure it's entirely answered. So is that first action, what you call the report, would it have the boundaries of the CFA and then some thinking about future zoning, et cetera, later? And I'm concerned not so much about appealability, but about accountability. I'm assuming there's going to be a deadline by which CFAs have to be at least designated. And I'd want some accountability if that designation or that first report, whatever it is you're calling, doesn't happen. What does that mean? Because that this has to start, and there has to be some accountability at that point for that first stop.
You bet. And
so,
yeah, go ahead.
So I'm it's unclear for me exactly where that accountability comes in, and then it might reflect that there's a need for a variety of different kinds of actions from the department, and more technical assistance or whatever what that accountability means. But we have to have something that we know this is going to be done by this date, and then the next steps come after that.
Right. And this is a concept that we're developing in our minds. Nothing is written at this time, but I think that's a good point, that we need to think ultimately, if we have a requirement, what are the consequences if that deadline is missed? And we'll need to think through that. Any other thoughts on this idea? All right. Well, great.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Heather.
Heather can go. I didn't raise my hand.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just going to add to what Mary Kyle just said, that there needs to be some sort of like what happens if things aren't met, but on more than just the CFA designation level. Like, what if the bike connectivity isn't met, or what if you've designated like the housing, but it doesn't actually get built, or different aspects of it don't meet the requirements that the intentions of the rules have laid out.
Sure. Yeah. I think that there are other aspects of the rules where there are timelines and other enforcement actions. I need to speak to that last point, though. I mean, we can't require local governments to build housing in climate-friendly areas. They don't have the resources. What we're trying to do, again, is to set the table for development, to streamline that development and make it possible. And we're asking local governments through the housing production strategy tool to look at actions they can take to promote that housing development. That's the process by which the department will engage with local governments, identify tools, provide technical support if that's available. All of those mechanisms to try to move the needle on our goals for climate-friendly areas. All right, Heather.
Yeah, I thought in one of the other meetings with DLCD this week, there was some mention about the ability to, and I'm not sure if it was in the meeting 10 packet or if, and I didn't see it quickly perusing through it, or if it's something you're considering, but the idea of jurisdictions being able to propose. So there are a series of deadlines, right, for each of these steps that are already in the rules. And when we've, as we put in our comments, when we've mapped those out, given, anytime we have to do a public process with a hearing, it's a minimum of 6 months to just do that. And then wanting to do meaningful public engagement before that, I think, for instance, is it the parking provisions only have 7 months to be able to adopt those from when the rules would actually go into effect, which is really just not enough time for that to happen. So just on the comment about the deadlines and when things would be due, is there provision, or is this something that you're considering that with respect to climate-friendly areas, that jurisdictions would be able to propose a different work plan to, I don't know if it's the commission or to DLCD that is a little bit different? I think that that's something that is allowed in the proposed scenario planning rules, and wasn't sure about if that was available for the CFAs or not.
That's a great question, Heather. Yes, the concept that you're referring to is being developed, and it would, to be clear, it's not exclusive just to CFA designation, but to the package of implementation for the climate-friendly, equitable communities work. And the concept would be that we are hearing as we go out to local governments that everybody's in a different place in terms of their TSP updates or identified goals that they're pursuing, and it seems that it would be beneficial to develop a process whereby a local government could put together a work plan for here's how we propose to step through this, and then that would be reviewed by the department or commission. We haven't really fleshed out what that process would look like, but that would also apply to CFA designation conceivably. Again, it's a concept under development. There's a reference to it in the cover memo for packet 10, but we really haven't fleshed out draft rules on this as of yet.
Okay, and so then anything related to that, I would think would, if you proposed an or allowed an alternate work plan, is what I'm thinking of it as, that there would be those connections to those enforcement provisions that we were just talking about related to the deadline. So in both cases, there would be kind of an enforcement component through the state. Right. What happens if we don't meet those? Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you.
You bet. Brock.
Yeah, I was just going to jump back to Elisa in your exchange just a second ago, talking about the accountability for not having the necessary housing development in the CFAs. You said that you can't require that development, obviously, but can lay out potential incentivizing actions. If that's the case, why is that 30% requirement still being linked to UGB expansion? And if this is a topic that we're going to jump on later, I can hold off until then, but I just wanted to pop it in right now.
You bet. So the first, and I'll speak to it a little bit. So the first draft of our climate-friendly area rules was pretty, I'll say, draconian in relation to UGB expansions. It essentially said, by this date, local governments would need to meet 30% of their housing within climate-friendly areas in order to expand their urban growth boundaries. Well, people rightfully responded back and said, let's think about what that might do to housing affordability and our ability as a local government to actually meet housing needs across the board. So we have amended that fairly significantly, and the provisions now essentially they allow local governments to expand UGBs based on residential needs as they have in the past. One additional component of that, however, is to require additional CFA designation, because the goal here is we need cities to grow more efficiently in the future if we're going to meet our climate goals. And so it's getting to growing more efficiently, but not precluding UGB expansions for residential needs more broadly. It doesn't say we can't have, any single family, neighborhoods anymore. But it is trying to move the needle.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. All right. Any other comments? Elisa?
Hi, I just was wondering if houses aren't built, like, because we can't prescribe that houses actually be built, we just can change the zoning and have the intention. If this doesn't work, what happens then? Like if cities designate their CFAs and they have the designated 30% that could be built and no houses are built and nothing actually changes in terms of climate change or equitable communities, what's the next step?
I think well, first of all, we have this new tool, housing production strategy process, that local governments, cities over 10,000, population above 10,000, are now required to think about. So every time they update their housing needs analysis, every 6 years within the metro area, every 8 years outside of Portland Metro, they will identify, take a fresh look at here's what our housing needs are for our community. And then 1 year later, after the H&A comes in, then they spend time identifying strategies to actually meet those housing needs. What are the levers that they can pull to get those housing needs accomplished? Part of the rules that we're proposing are including consideration of housing development within climate-friendly areas. And so we will be identifying tools in the toolbox that help housing development in climate-friendly areas broadly, but also, with probably some emphasis on affordable housing provision within those areas, again, to get at the concerns about displacement that might otherwise occur in those areas. So that will be the tool that will be used over time. And we're hopeful that we see a number of strategies employed where we can share that information out to other local governments and say, hey, that looks like this has been effective in this community, similar situation to yours, So that is one tool. I will say if generally this package of regulations isn't successful, I think there's opportunities for amending rules in the future. And adjustments over time if this program doesn't work. But we do have sort of that check valve to look at housing production, how that's going, what tools can be employed to promote that level of development. Jonathan.
Thank you. And there's a considerable amount of work that's expected on the part of jurisdictions to get to the point of designation. And if this was a conventional planning project where the intention is to get to a point where you're rezoning property and writing new development code, which I think it is, I would expect that work being done that's outlined to get to designation would be part of that project, and it's just part of that public process, that public land use process where you're going to your planning commissions, you're going to the public, you're doing committee, all that kind of stuff. And so what I'm trying to understand is what is the value, and is there a loss of efficiency in having this sort of hypothetical work done this first year, and then you give a report to DLCD, who then provides some feedback and has some opportunity for the larger public, I guess, not the city-specific public, but the larger state public, to be able to look at that. Is there any reason not to just say there's a 2-year process, and at the end of this 2 years, you need to have the zoning and the development code in place that implements the rule? That's my question.
I think that's a valid question, Jonathan, and I don't know that I have a full and complete response to that. Other than I think it allows for that opportunity of like, okay, here's the work we're doing. Here are the areas we're considering for CFAs, review and comment. And so there is that feedback loop that's built into that process. Could that be done locally? Yeah, it could be done on the local level as well. But really, if what we say is you got 2 years to zone and all of that sort of thing, then there's no opportunity to course correct sort of midway through that process. And so I guess that's the benefit that I see. But I think your point is a valid point. All right, let's go ahead and move on to other topics on our list. Let's see. Let's see what we've got here. We've really talked about land use assumptions. All right, I guess I'd like to speak a little bit to the mixed use development context. And the rule currently has minimum required residential densities. Some of the commenters have said, does it really make sense to establish minimum residential densities in a mixed use development? So for example, what if you have like an office building with a few residential dwellings, incorporated into that? If we set a minimum residential density, we might be inhibiting some housing production that would otherwise occur within a mixed use development context. We've been thinking through that idea, it may make some sense to relax or let go of that minimum density requirement for a mixed use building for that reason. One of the ideas here is that we want to make sure that the development that occurs in CFAs is of a sufficient intensity, right? We need that mix of uses. And so the concept that we're thinking about in terms of amending that minimum density requirement would be to establish, okay, if you're doing a mixed use development and you're below that minimum density, then an FAR minimum might be applied to that development. So an FAR is a floor area ratio that essentially gets to the level of development on that development site. What that requirement is, I don't know if it's 2.0. So the scenario might be if you have a 40,000 square foot site and your FAR is 2.0, that means your building needs to be 80,000 square feet. Okay. Or if it's 1.0, it's going to be 40,000 square feet. So, and that can cover the entire site, or it can be multiple stories. But essentially it says you need a certain level of development intensity in those areas. And in that context, if you have a lot of office and a little bit of residential, we're still ultimately moving in the direction that we need to move in. Are there any thoughts about that approach or concerns or comments? Seeing none. Oh, here we go. Sandy?
Yeah, I guess I like that idea. It's a topic I've been struggling with in terms of how do you calculate density in these mixed use zones when you're balancing both employment and residential, especially in a vertical sense. So if you have 3 stories of office and then you have only 1 or 2 dwelling units up at the top, how do you deal with that? And so I think your idea of a floor area ratio is a intriguing one. I haven't really thought through it to know what the appropriate how you would calculate what is okay, but I like that concept.
Thank you. Heather?
Yeah, so I should have brought this up at the last conversation. I didn't know we were kind of closing on how we designate
that's okay.
CFAs, but this is related. So I think the standards, so the minimum development standards for a CFA, I think kind of go back to our comment about the one size fits all. So if the intent, it feels like, at least for us, when we kind of look at these areas that could potentially be CFAs in the city, there's kind of downtown and around downtown and West University, these higher density areas. And then we've got some corridors that are doing some mixed use, higher density planning, but not entirely. They wouldn't meet the standards that are being discussed right now. And then we've got, these neighborhood centers, which our neighborhood centers, really wouldn't meet the standards that are being talked about right now, particularly regarding allowing the maximum height of about 8 stories. And so the definition of a climate-friendly area says that it shall be designated in areas that are served or planned for service by high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services. And so we certainly have some neighborhood centers that have they have sidewalks, they are on a bike route. I wouldn't say they have high transit service. So I'm curious what that definition is, because we couldn't find a definition about what high quality ped, bike, and transit means. But that seems important for the definition, because that would probably limit where we would be planning CFAs for, and then would impact our comments on what the appropriate development standards are. That said, I also like the idea of having multiple options. So if you can't meet this, then this, like you were proposing. But I think some of those comments all really get back to what the intent is. Are we really focusing on downtowns and really like high density areas, which I think Sandy was bringing up before, some of our medium density areas that our neighborhood centers wouldn't really count. And again, that's because of the kind of one size fits all. Even with the outcomes section, it's still it's one specific outcome. So I, again, appreciate the different options and the different routes, but I think that some of our comments on the specifics are a little bit challenging, because not totally understanding or being comfortable with the one size fits all option. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Matt.
So does this kind of or could it be addressed by the performance or outcomes based option, which seems to look at, allowing for jobs and dwelling units to kind of be put into one sort of performance measure? And, if so, maybe the thing to do is to look at adjusting that requirement, which is like 40 jobs and housing units or housing units, I guess, per acre.
And when you say this, you're referring to the whole mixed use concept. Yeah. Okay. All right.
I assume that's what that part of the performance measure was designed to address.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah. So I'm taking one step backwards. We know that the number of housing, the housing needs for people with disabilities is underestimated. And I'm curious, as we're talking about new developments, the mixed use developments and new housing in the CFAs, is there a way to request that jurisdictions track the percent or the number of housing units that are in line with accessibility standards or universal design standards, so that we know whether or not we're actually closing the gap for people with disabilities who might need accessible units, or if we are not closing that gap, we might actually inadvertently be making things worse for people with disabilities and further displace them or not encourage, not enable them to live in the areas where we are trying to promote growth.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great point. And we've looked into a little bit, what we can do under ADA requirements and how building code interacts with that. There are some circumstances where there are requirements for accessible units. Some types of development don't necessarily have those requirements. However, I think your idea of tracking the production of accessible units in climate-friendly areas is an intriguing one. Because at least it will give us are we making progress here? Again, that may be an area where a housing production strategy might be able to help to facilitate that level of development. And I know, for both state and federal housing, programs that support affordable housing development, they typically do include accessible requirements for that development. So I see that reporting as maybe an important component of the rule. So thank you for that. Jonathan.
Thank you. So in terms of the issue of a mixed use building and how to calculate, does it meet its densities? If you have a mixed use district in which you establish a floor area ratio requirement for non-residential, and you have a requirement for residential based on density units, by density units per acre. You could look at a mixed use building then and do kind of a proportional analysis. That is, if the site, for example, would require 10 units, if it was built just as residential, or if it would require 10,000 square feet if it's built as non-residential. If the building has 5,000 feet of non-residential and 5 units, then proportionally it's meeting that standard, if you get what I mean. So that's I could share a formula with you that has been used in Gresham. I think this conversation also talks about the value of thinking of climate-friendly areas as being a mix of zoning, not just a single zone, so that you have some areas that you're going to devote just to residential, that you can walk to your place where you have your kind of conventional mixed use center, and you can have some areas that are employment where you can walk to your center, and it might allow a little bit of mixed use, but you're not really worried about what residential occurs there. So those are just the 2 points I wanted to bring up.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. And yes, if you could share that with me, I'd really appreciate it. Mary Kyle.
Yeah, I appreciate what Jonathan just said. And I've always been thinking this not as one size fits all, though I do realize the draft rules might sound a bit like that now, but as CFAs can be of different scales throughout a city, as long as collectively across a city, they are zoned for the capacity of 30% of total housing across those. But I think there's different scales. I hope there are. And I think the other part we're missing about that is, they have to complement that mode shift. That's the critical part of this, is providing people opportunities to not drive or drive as often or as far. And therefore, those walkable, bikeable networks are critical to this. I don't see that all CFAs are going to have great transit. I can think of a couple of places in inner Portland that meet everything we've described for a CFA, except they don't really have great transit. I mean, to me, Selwood doesn't have great transit. So, but I think that's a neighborhood center that's a mix of uses and has certainly higher densities in it. So I'm hoping that we have a scale. So as long as, collectively those CFAs are meeting those standards. Anyway.
Thank you. No, that's one of the ideas I've heard is, particularly for the larger cities, we have standards that say, set pretty high minimum residential densities and pretty high building heights. So one thought would be, okay, so maybe for a larger city, you designate at least one area that meets those standards. Would it make sense in other more like neighborhood centers? And this would probably follow the metro model, the 2040 growth concept, where you have smaller centers that might have different standards. We do allow for lower heights, again, in those larger cities to allow a little bit of that nuance, but it might be something that we expand in rules to provide a little more flexibility. So, all right. Any other comments on the general topics we've been talking about here? No? Great. I'm not sure. Michael, did you have a question, or is that just your, okay, all right, good. All right, so we've talked timeline. Let's see, from our list, we have standards. So, well, one of the issues that was raised is street connectivity standards to ensure that CFAs are really walkable and bikeable places and connections to other destinations. I would assert that those requirements are in the proposed rules as written, both the identification of key destinations and then prioritization of improvements to routes to access those key destinations in between if you have multiple climate friendly areas, but also in the transportation review that is associated with climate friendly areas, with the zoning package that's adopted. Local governments will be required to look at the transportation infrastructure in those proposed CFAs, the PED, bike, transit infrastructure, identify any gaps, and develop a plan to address those gaps as part of that work. So take a look at those rules if there are improvements needed. I mean, what's super helpful for us at this point is if people have specific language suggestions for how the rule language might be worded to more clearly address some of these issues, we would very much appreciate that level of input. Let's see. I think we've talked about displacement. I guess let me just explain how the rules would look at, again, that potential for displacement and better inclusion within climate-friendly areas. So the way that the draft rules currently are designed, we have, again, those local governments identifying those areas per this new concept, kind of doing that study, doing an analysis of equitable outcomes. So, with that upzoning, it may be, you're increasing allowances for development in those areas. There's the potential for displacement of populations. The local government would be also doing that analysis based on some demographic information and then identifying tools. The tools that we're looking at are informed by a couple of things. The anti-displacement, anti-gentrification toolkit that Dr. Bates has developed for the department is something that we've talked about a little bit in the RAC. That is something that we are working on operationalizing for local governments to make that available. We're hopeful to have spatial mapping tools available at the statewide level also that would provide some level of demographic information for local governments to use in that analysis. And then lastly, housing production strategy toolkit includes a host of different tools that can be used to address potential displacement in particular. And the nice thing about Dr. Bates' work is that study specifically looks at the toolkit and identifies tools that are most effective at mitigating displacement. It's a challenging issue. I mean, I don't think there's any magical solutions, but it is a required review that comes about as part of the climate-friendly area designation process. I don't know if, hopefully that answers questions, but are there comments, concerns on that issue? Damian.
Thank you. Is it possible to have somebody drop a link in the chat to Dr. Bates's toolkit? Because I know I think the department might have done like a training on this or a presentation earlier this year, but I'll be honest, I cannot find that email or whatever documents I might have saved. Please and
I
thank
think
you.
that's, yeah, I think that's possible. I believe there's something on our website that links to, you can view the actual video that was done, but also links to the materials. And we can either, if we can't find that for you today, we will follow up and get that information to you. Looks like maybe there's something in the chat already. Oh, all right. Okay, let's see, what else do we have here? Densities, decision. Oh, parks, open space, street trees. So this is an issue, you know, where we know what we don't want to do with climate friendly areas is create these urban heat islands that become uninhabitable when we have these extreme weather events. We know that open space also helps to, you know, create an attractive and appealing space for people to live in. The challenge that we have is if we put it in rule, it's a one size fits all generally. And so we have language in a couple of areas that essentially says, hey, as local governments are designating CFAs, they need to look to provision of these things. I think that we will likely talk about, you know, take a look at your parks plans, but also development standards or any improvement projects that might bring that open space into climate friendly areas where it's not currently available. There are some climate friendly areas, there's some areas that will be designated as climate friendly areas that already have some of those amenities either in that area or nearby. There's also the question of street trees, and you know, would it make sense to establish a street tree requirement, a general requirement for local governments to require street trees, which basically help to separate pedestrians from vehicular traffic. They also provide important shading and make for a more pleasant urban environment. My suspicion is most local governments affected by this rule probably already have street tree programs, but I want to raise these kind of questions for discussion by the group. I will say, when we surveyed the RAC on this question, generally the feedback we heard was maybe this is better, an area that's better in guidance than in rule, so that the department might follow up with resources, best practices, that kind of information after the rules are adopted versus putting in sort of a prescriptive requirement in this area. So any thoughts about these issues? Heather.
So in the land use requirements in CFAs in 323, I think it talks about prioritizing any government facility to be located in CFAs. And I think in our comments that we submitted a couple of weeks ago, we were wondering if that was the intent, was that it was more supposed to be focused on or intended to be focused on public gathering spaces, parks, plazas, things like that, rather than other state facilities that might actually take up a lot of land. And, you know, certainly offices make a lot of sense, but I don't really know as far as, you know, state hospitals or jails or things like that. Does that really make sense to be in what you want to use your CFA area for? So I was curious if there had been any clarification about that.
That's a good question. I think our intent is, you know, for those public serving local government facilities, climate friendly areas are a great candidate in terms of, you know, where they should be located, easy for people to access, good transportation and transit connections to reach those destinations. Not all government facilities, you know, are gonna make sense there. Maybe your public works, you know, facility obviously, you know, isn't gonna want to be in a climate friendly area, but that is the thinking. I think the rule speaks to public serving, but maybe again, if there's suggested language there that gets more to that intent, that's what we're speaking to. Barbara.
Hi. So with regard to street trees, you can't hear, right?
I can hear faintly, yes.
Okay, so with regard to street trees, our jurisdiction really doesn't have enough staff to develop a street tree program. Usually street trees are planted in the right of way. And we just don't have the funding available to hire staff to, one, maintain the trees, or two, to require the private properties to maintain the trees. So we're really concerned about staffing issues with regard to that. In our letter, we noted that the city of Cornelius is really on the line of functioning as a city in terms of our tax base. We really need additional industrial development and commercial development to offset the cost of services to residential development. And adding additional potential staff is not something that we can do from a budget perspective. We just don't have the funding.
All right, all right. Thank you for that, Barbara. Damian?
Thanks. I wanted to go back to the topic of government facilities in CFAs. Right now, the rule under 3 uses the word prioritize locating government facilities. And I'm trying to get some clarity if prioritize means look there first, or be prepared to justify why you didn't locate something there as you've identified your CFA. And one of the things I'm thinking about with respect to Bend is we are, as a city, in the process of looking at potentially a new city hall site. I don't know if it's going to be in a potential CFA, but I'm just trying to look ahead to see if that's something we need to be prepared to address in a future decision.
That's a good question. And how this gets operationalized is probably going to vary by jurisdiction. I think in terms of that prioritization, as the part of the package of comprehensive plan amendments that are adopted with CFA designation, I think we would be looking for potentially a comp plan policy that speaks to that. And I think language that prioritizes is really basically what we're looking for. It is not an absolute requirement, but I think it would require, say, with a decision to locate out of those areas, some findings that say, here's why this site makes sense for this facility. We know it's not here. Here's how the public's going to be able to access it. You know, that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
All right, sorry, my dog's barking. Hopefully that's not too loud. All right, no other comments on that, so good. Another issue that's come up is dimensional requirements for climate-friendly areas. So the current rule has a minimum dimension for larger cities of 1,000 feet. So width can be no narrower than 1,000 feet in width. The smaller cities, just 5 to 10,000, are allowed to go down to 500 feet in width for those minimum dimensions. The thinking here is that, again, within these climate-friendly areas, they need to be big enough to generate sort of a critical mass of, housing and employment opportunities and that sort of thing. And concerns, frankly, we've seen some research in the literature that says, hey, when we look at really narrow transit-oriented corridors, you can sort of reinforce these patterns of, well, that's where the multifamily people live along that line, and outside of that, it's a completely different area. So we want to avoid that kind of social segregation, if you will, and that's part of what is informing that dimensional standard. As we think through this, though, we recognize there are many contexts where there might be significant barriers, just physical constraints. They might be topographical, it might be a highway that might narrow that. And so I think we would propose amending those rules to allow or account for that kind of variation or those kind of features that might inhibit dimensional requirements for those areas. So that's how we're talking about addressing that issue, and I'd like to hear any concerns or suggestions or comments on that proposal. Matt.
Yeah, I don't understand the basis for 1,000 feet. I think saying 1,000 feet in width is problematic just because things spatially don't necessarily correspond to that sort of description. And when I'm trying to explain this to elected officials or appointed officials on a planning commission, I have to be able to explain why you have made that determination. It's difficult for me to do that. I do understand, what you're getting at with the minimum size, I guess, and maybe that's something that's better addressed with some sort of minimum area or something of that nature. But I would also say that, your comment about, transit corridors and this issue of, segregating different kinds of residential development, I don't think the issue is this minimum 1,000 square feet. It's the fact that you're limiting the types of building or of dwelling units that can be developed in CFAs. I mean, that's much more determinate of that sort of segregated residential pattern. I think it has nothing to do with these more sort of linear configurations of transit supportive corridors. And in some places, I mean, that's a historical development pattern. It could be the result of, environmental constraints, things like that. So I would just prefer that 1,000-foot rule be eliminated. If you want to replace it, try something with area. And I don't know exactly what that would be, but those are my comments on that.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Any other thoughts on this topic? Heather.
I think we suggested or raised the issue similar to what Matt was saying, but a different issue that might come up is just not any sort of minimum dimension like the 1,000 feet has the potential to bisect a lot, where you're saying that part of the lot is in the CFA until it gets down to 1,000 feet. And that becomes pretty problematic. We try not to apply zoning to partial lots where possible. So just wanted to raise that issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things we've talked about is, maybe asserting a block standard, just based on, a number of blocks or, that type of thing, although that's going to vary pretty broadly, even within a local government. But that might be one way to address that issue.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder if we're getting at it with the minimum densities and we're getting at uses, I just wonder how many more standards we need to actually put in the rules compared to, because at least for Eugene, I can only speak for us, but, the one area that we just tested out the CFA capacity methodology, and looking at that area obviously was around downtown, and then you kind of expand that out and you're looking at so many different zones that all have their own standards, and obviously we would have to change a lot of those to potentially change those to address these. But I just wonder if it makes more sense to like hit the big ticket items in the rule and then let the jurisdictions deal with the specific development standards. I understand what you're trying to get at, is not having phantom capacity, not relying on phantom capacity, but there's just so many things that could come into play when we have these really prescriptive standards. So just a thought.
All right, thank you. Any other thoughts on this topic of dimensions of CFAs? No. Okay. All right. Good. One thing we haven't really talked about, and this is a point that a number of people have raised, is, hey, what about employment in climate-friendly areas? So we're focusing really on housing. And the reason is not that housing is the only thing we care about. We need housing, we need employment, we need services, we need it all to be in these areas. But the tools for monitoring and making progress on housing are already available to us. And frankly, what we've heard on the development side is that generally it's the housing, getting the housing into these areas that is the most challenging. That's probably not true in all areas, but that's kind of what we've heard. In terms of employment, obviously we can't set minimum employment densities. The idea of implementing that at a local level just makes my head explode. So what we've talked about is looking at, again, guidance, looking at EOAs, economic opportunity analyses, as they're developed in the future, and including thinking about having local governments think about employment and what they can do to foster employment opportunities in climate-friendly areas. We are not proposing any changes to rules in that regard. Frankly, that's outside the scope, and we're pretty far down the tracks on this. But I think it's worth discussing, and it's certainly worth us, and when I say us, I mean DLCD, developing some guidance around the employment side of climate-friendly areas. Any thoughts or reflections on that? Damian.
Thank you. I think it is worth at least addressing a technical guidance for CFAs, especially as we're looking at, not necessarily allocating jobs to a CFA for that specific purpose, but thinking about what types of commercial services, offices, retail are going to be necessary to be located in CFAs so that people do have that real choice to meet their daily needs without getting in their car. As an example, I think something I mentioned at a prior meeting was, looking at that example of the urban target in terms of how to, not just allow something like that in your code, but, looking at potential incentives, tools, so that, if we do have that time in Ben, for example, we're looking at a second target, then that might be a more viable option to look at something like that in that kind of a location. Recognizing it's also going to require a certain level of people, within a certain walking distance for it to be viable.
Sure, you got it. Sandy.
So I'm not sure how this directly answers your question, but one thing that we've been thinking about in Springfield is this idea of looking to the future where people are really doing a lot of telework from home. And so the jobs are actually in the homes. And how do you account for that in terms of your employment planning? But we've talked about creating particular neighborhoods that are conducive to that, that have high connectivity, have maybe daycare options right nearby, that could have support services for, you know, if you need to go do more office kind of things nearby. And so in that sense, you're creating employment right there in the home, which is of course zero travel. And so counting for that is not how our traditional models have been working when we're looking at land and employment needs. So how does that factor in? As I think we're not yet sure how much of the future or what percentage that will be. You know, we're still coming out of the pandemic, but I think it's a reality.
That's a really good point. I don't, of course, don't have answers, but that's a great point. You know, back in the day, it was, you know, people talk about live work units and that, but anymore it's sort of like, yeah, that's my house. It's my live work unit. You know, it doesn't need to have a sign out front or what have you. So, yeah. And I think CFAs would provide a great opportunity for those kinds of uses where you know, going to have that services nearby. Any other thoughts on the employment side of CFAs? All right, seeing none. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, and I just want to make sure, are there things we haven't talked about that people wish to talk about? I tried to cover the list, but just want to make sure I haven't missed anything. Sandy, it looks like you have something.
Yeah, I mean, people have already said this when they were putting the topics on the list, but, you know, when I look at what's happening in Springfield, and, you know, I realized that when I showed my screen before, I had tried to make it more available for you all, and I had mixed up the numbers. So whoever was looking at this later, my numbers were in the wrong columns. But anyway, for a long time, we struggled to even get multifamily housing. The multifamily housing that we had built was subsidized housing. And now more recently, in the past, say 4 years, we've actually been getting some multifamily housing. But, you know, we had Smart Growth America do an analysis for us funded by AARP with Locus. And they determined that the only viable multifamily housing, and even that was on the edge, was 2-story kind of walk-ups. And those are not the kind of densities that we're talking about for CFAs. It's not financially viable to build those in Springfield at this time. And so when I look at the densities of the housing, multifamily or multi-unit housing that is either under construction or proposed, it's in the range of 16, 17, 20, 22. We have one at 27 dwelling units per net acre. And so, as I mentioned before, if we're having to, which I realize we should probably talk about further, but, you know, if we're having to designate all of the climate friendly areas to be at densities that these are not allowed, I think we're really either not going to get multifamily housing because people can't build to the higher densities, it's not feasible, or it's going to be built out in other areas. And so I just really wonder what the impact of that will be on affordability when we're really struggling to get more multifamily or multi-unit housing in Springfield, and are now starting to get there. But the only projects that are even getting close to what you're talking about that are even contemplated are partnerships with our urban renewal district. So you know, the government is having to partner to make these happen, which is good. I mean, and that can maybe help the market respond, but we can only do that, you know, in very focused areas. And so when we're talking about creating climate friendly areas for 30% of our population, within this time frame, we need either a whole lot more resource, or we're going to have to adjust the standards to avoid pushing the negative consequences out, is all I'm trying to say.
Sure. No, that's a good point, and we've heard that from others that, you know, the market isn't producing this kind of development right now. And I wish we had time and resources to really do more detailed market analysis. But frankly, we are trying to move the needle here. And it may be a circumstance where, you know, the zoning is put in place and there is less response than we're hoping for. You know, over time, we're hopeful that will change, but that is, yeah. And I do want to make the point again that we're not talking about you now have to lock up 30% of your actual housing capacity in climate friendly areas. We're asking local governments to zone accordingly, but your actual housing capacity, you know, per the HNA HCA process is going to be based on development trends in the recent past in terms of determining, you know, your land needs and planning out to the planning horizon of 20 years. It will, you know, again, we're hoping to see more intensive development in CFAs over time. You know, the example that, you know, we've heard quite a lot, City of Portland had zoned areas on the east side of the river for, you know, more higher density, more mixed use for quite a while. Those regulations were on the books, and it took 20 years or more for the market to actually see that opportunity and respond. And it is responding now. And I can say their production numbers are pretty astonishing. I had the opportunity to review those recently, but we know Portland is the exception in the state. It has the most robust development market in the state, and we don't expect to see those levels of production from all of the local governments elsewhere. Jeremy.
Oh, thanks. And this builds off that. I really appreciate that exchange that Sandy just had. I thought that was really helpful. So just one thing to back up Sandy's comments, though, is that you know, I'd mentioned the need for sort of more analysis, and I think some, you know, analysis focused on these markets where these rules will be, you know, required to be in place to sort of figure out how they'll actually play out on the ground, and then make tweaks and redesign the rules so that they actually do help achieve the objectives we're trying to achieve would be useful. But my second comment, just sort of building off of that, is I'm still trying to fully get my head around the issue of sort of what happens if these areas don't produce the level of housing that we desire that they produce, and communities are still trying to meet their housing need. And in one area where this is on the UGB expansion piece, and this 50% requirement that if a community is going to expand its UGB, then 50% of the housing units that you're expanding for need to be accommodated, or you need to designate a new CFA that would be large enough to accommodate 50% of those units, if I understand that's what the rule is saying. And so I'm kind of trying to understand how that wouldn't stymie a community's ability to meet its housing need if the reason why it needs the UGB expansion is because the units aren't being produced inside the CFAs it's designated, or because the types of housing units that are needed are not the type that would be accommodated inside a CFA. How is requiring the city to designate another CFA that would accommodate 50% of its units going to solve that city's problem? Wouldn't it just double down on the problem that the city's already having, that the CFA isn't really accommodating what it needs?
It's a great question. And, you know, I think I would need to get down into the weeds a little bit in terms of how that's addressed in rules. I will say I think there is a tweak that we need to make to our proposed amendments to the Housing Rule Division 8 to really clarify this point. But it is, again, that difference between zoning to allow certain things, but also understanding that the HNA process is identifying housing needs and allowing local governments to continue to plan for it. So it's not that with that UGB expansion, we're requiring that 50% of that housing be accommodated in CFAs. It's that we need cities to grow more efficiently over time. And so they need to designate additional areas to accommodate CFAs in conjunction with expanding urban growth boundaries. Those areas may be different, right? You might be expanding your UGB to meet a different kind of housing need, and you would continue to meet that need in those expansion areas, but there would also be an associated additional designation of climate-friendly areas along with that. And Jeremy, I'm happy to have this conversation in more detail with you after this meeting, because it's an important point. And I'm very open to input on this, but we're trying to navigate that difference between how cities can continue to plan for their housing needs, but also move the needle towards more efficient and climate-friendly growth patterns.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. You bet.
I just wanted to encourage you to look at under the CFA methodology, there's an allowance that local governments that include a height bonus for affordable housing, that impacts how you do the capacity analysis, and just with the thought of encouraging as much affordable housing as possible, that maybe height bonus isn't the only thing. I know we allow up to 150% of the maximum density that's allowed in a zone if you do affordable housing. And so we'd want to use that and, allow that as encouraging for, if you have those kinds of standards, just to get as much affordable housing as we can.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sandy.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kevin. I'm not trying to beat this horse, but I hear you say allow, provide governments the opportunity to allow these CFAs, but I'm reading in the rules under section 0320 5 and 6 that that it's requiring that we can't have housing unless it meets these minimum densities, whether that's either through 5 or the alternative of 6. And so I think there is a difference between allowing high density housing or requiring only high density housing. And so I wonder if there's we've been struggling, and if anybody locally knows, we have Glenwood. It's been 20 years that we've been trying to set up a place where we'd have some really high quality, multimodal, high density, mixed use area. And the city's committed to that, and they've stayed the course. But we can't do that for every CFA in the city. That's not practical. So, maybe there are some places where it is a requirement that you have to jump to that high standard, but others that it could be more incremental over time.
Right, right. Okay, thank you, Sandy. I appreciate that. And I think we're just about at time here. What I am hoping to accomplish is we're going to sit down and think about everything that's been said here, get amended language out for these rules, and if we can, maybe have another meeting of this work group. I'm not sure exactly when that might be. It might be early January before our last RAC meeting. But I really appreciate everyone's engagement today. This has been a great conversation. It's really helpful to me. And if you continue to have concerns or you want to provide additional input, please reach out to me directly. I'm available by the phone, email, what have you, as we develop these rules. So yes, please, to another work group. All right. Fantastic. So with that, I will let you go, and hope everyone enjoys their upcoming weekend, and we'll continue this conversation later on. So again, thank you. Bye-bye.